Well, welcome everyone to our ninth Lake Stewardship Workshop. I'm Jim Irwin, Chair of the Rocky Mountain Biosphere Reserve. I'll be hosting tonight's workshop. Dennis Hodgson and Daryl Kynes will be assisting. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Rocky Mountain Biosphere Reserve is in Treaty 2 and 4 territories of the Anishinaabe people, and say that we respect and share their all important teachings that water is a sacred gift, essential for all life. Since 1986, the Rocky Mountain Biosphere Reserve has been bringing people together to share their knowledge for the well-being of our communities. In this respect, we're pleased to have two fisheries biologists, John Whitaker and Robert Sopuck, share their experiences and perspectives of our Parkland lakes in our workshop tonight. Our first presentation will be by John Whitaker. John farms with his wife Sharon in the municipality of Clan William Erickson and is a fisheries biologist with years of experience working on our prairie pothole lakes. And he doesn't like the term retired. John worked as a fisheries biologist for the province in his earlier days and has been involved in many conservation organizations and projects over the years, including the Rocky Mountain Biosphere Reserve, where he has served as chair. John's presentation tonight is entitled, "Where Did Our Lakes Come From and Where Are They Headed?" Take it away, John.
Thanks, Jim, and welcome everyone. A little bit of personal history. I grew up in Saskatoon, did my graduate work at University of Saskatchewan, and in 1968 got a job at the brand new Freshwater Institute in Winnipeg. And a project had been developed called Rainbow Trout Farming in Prairie Winterkill Lakes, and the study area was along the south side of Rocky Mountain National Park from approximately Erickson to Elphinstone, south of 45 Highway and north of 45 Highway, not quite to the park. So that's how I came to this area in 1968. And by 1976, I had left the government and we became permanent residents and started farming, and we've been here ever since. So where did these lakes come from? Well, they're a product of glaciation. And some of these timescales I'm going to talk about are really hard for me to understand. When you talk about 100,000 years, I don't really know what that means. I have no grasp of it, except that it's a very, very long time. And a lot of the processes that led to the formation of these lakes are in the thousands of years category. So the glaciers modified the landscape in two ways. One, they acted like big bulldozers, say from 200,000 years ago down to about 70,000 years ago. And they came down from the north in several waves. And like bulldozers, they pushed up the underburden, and the glaciers left kind of a hummocky terrain. And then the glaciers melted, starting about 70,000 years ago and going down to, well, they say the Rocky Mountain area was ice-free in about 6,000 years ago. So that's a span of like about 60,000 years that it took those glaciers to melt. That's a heck of a long time. And when you figure that there was up to 2 kilometers of ice over top of us right now at the peak of glaciation, you can see why it took a long time to melt. And it was the runoff from glacial melt, as well as a lot of the material that was entrained in the glaciers, because they were ice, but they weren't clean ice, that deposited on the landscape and left us with the situation that we had, say, going back a couple of hundred years. And I guess it's best described as a very water-rich landscape. There were just thousands and thousands of water bodies, largely because of the hummocky terrain that the glacier had left. And there are signs of glacial activity now that you can see. The Carberry Sandhills is sand that was deposited by the Assiniboine River carrying meltwater from Saskatchewan. The lighter fraction were carried into the Red River Valley, and they formed the Red River clays. There's beach ridges here and there. I guess the most obvious one is at Arden Ridge, and I often pretend when I'm driving from Gladstone to Neepawa that I'm driving across the bottom of Glacial Lake Agassiz, and then you come up to the Arden Ridge. The land goes up about 8 meters. You come up out of the water, and from then on, you're driving on dry land. You've just ascended the first prairie step. So these thousands and thousands of water bodies that were left after glacial melt, most of them were small. They were landlocked, no permanent outflow. They were shallow, and they did not contain fish. Other water bodies, talking here more like Sandy Lake or Ditch Lake, were large enough to have inflows and outflows, and they were connected to a permanent drainage network. And eventually fish found their way from wherever fish spent the ice age upstream through the flowing water and populated these lakes with fish. We also have Clear Lake, which is worth a program all by itself, Jim. But Clear Lake is a bit of an anomaly in that it's large compared to other lakes in the area. There's a lot of deep water, and it's got a very small drainage area. So it's got a water residence time, and this is a measure that biologists use to determine how quickly water changes in a lake. It's the amount of time it takes for the water to completely change once. The water residence time for Clear Lake is 150 years compared to Lake Winnipeg, where the water residence time is something like 4.5 years. So you have to be extremely careful with Clear Lake because anything you put into it is going to stay there because the outflow is sporadic and very poorly developed. So these lakes would have started out as being quite low in nutrient and low in salt because they were composed of meltwater initially. And then as the prairie developed or the forest developed and runoff started to filter through vegetation and decaying vegetation, these lakes would have been very slowly getting richer. The primary nutrient here, and which is what I'm going to be talking about most, is phosphorus. So as the phosphorus concentration went up, the lakes would develop a richer algal community. They would develop a richer zooplankton community, bottom fauna, and they would become very slowly getting more productive. So this is the situation that our forefathers would have experienced 150 years ago when people of European extraction first came here. And at that point, things started to change really quickly from the standpoint of phosphorus and lake enrichment. In the first place, we plowed up the prairie and we developed the forest for agriculture. This meant that a lot of soil particles that previously were fastened to the landscape were now finding their way into these water bodies and lakes. And soil particles are a source of phosphorus. Phosphorus tends to bind to soil particles. After a few years of really good crops without fertilizer, it became apparent that the land was running out of nutrient and fertilizer started to be applied. So I don't know what the situation is lately, but if you look at the situation through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 80s, there were progressively larger amounts of fertilizer and phosphate fertilizer being applied to farmland. I know the intent is that all of this fertilizer will end up in crop and be removed, but not all of it does, and some of it enters runoffs and ends up in water. Fertilizer use was very small at the start, and I don't know if any of you have got an old drill on steel in the yard with an old Elephant brand fertilizer attachment on it, but those fertilizer boxes were just tiny. So initially they were putting on very little. And now if you look at modern fertilization rates to get an optimum yield, they're quite a bit higher. We also started to develop farmsteads, and often that meant livestock. And so you'd have a farmhouse on a quarter section, they'd have livestock, they'd have a barn. The manure from the animals oftentimes ended up in the lake or on the lake shore. And there are stories of farmers upstream of Gimli feeding cattle on the Icelandic River because in the spring when the river woke up, all of that manure would end up in Lake Winnipeg. It was sort of self-cleaning operation. So this also is producing more and more phosphorus in the water, and these lakes are now, after a period under natural conditions of getting very slowly more rich, now the pace of enrichment has speeded up a lot. And then we started living around the lakes. I mean, Sandy Lake is a lovely lake to have a home on, and a Ditch Lake is another one, just beautiful cottages on Clear Lake. We started to use them for our recreation, and some of these developments required sewage lagoons, and the discharge from sewage lagoons also often found itself into water that was connected to the drainage network. And it's another source of phosphorus and enrichment. And then the last one is probably the biggest one, and this occurred after World War II. The development of tanks supposedly led to development of better and better bulldozers. And bulldozers started to appear on the land, and more bush got pushed, and land developed for agriculture. But also drainage started big time. And a lot of farmers over the past few years have got a bulldozer and a scraper in the yard, and it's part of the farm operation that you drain these wetlands. Because if you take an area like the Manitoba pothole country, you can see how all of those potholes and sloughs would interfere with large-scale farming. And what it was doing was it was turning these small water bodies that were landlocked and not contributing nutrient to the drainage system, it was turning them into contributing water bodies, so that the phosphorus and carbon that were part of these sloughs was now being mobilized and was coming downstream and was ending up in larger and larger lakes. So that's where we stand right now. I mean, as far as that's where the lakes have come from, and where they're heading, as far as we've heard in this series as well, is they're heading in the direction of increasing enrichment until that enrichment becomes enough that you start to get problems with algal blooms. And situation on Sandy Lake is quite typical. So I want to provide a bit of advice here. And if I were talking to Daryl and Dennis regarding Sandy Lake, I would say, if you want continued health of that lake, you have to determine where the phosphorus is coming from. And Jay has done a very nice study of Kerr Lake, where he's shown the source of phosphorus. And he has also said that, and I think we can ask him to maybe help with designing a phosphorus study of the watersheds of Sandy Lake that could be carried out by volunteers with a minimum amount of sampling, so that you could determine where the phosphorus is coming from. And some of the things you would have to look at would be the watersheds of all of the tributary streams that go into the lake. And a lot of this can be done on a computer exercise using Google Earth and maybe some of the LiDAR imagery that the watershed district has. So have a look at human occupancy of the watersheds and determine where the potential sources of phosphorus could be, and then get out there and take some samples during runoff in the spring to see exactly where it's coming from. I'm not suggesting that Dennis and Daryl get out and do this. This is an ideal project for a geography class from Brandon University. And I know Rod McGinn used to do this with his students, where they would go to a lake and they would study the lake and determine things like where the nutrients were coming from. Okay, so before I move along and tell a couple of lake stories, another thing I wanted to mention was there was a question during the presentation on Lake Minnedosa regarding Otter Lake, and why Otter Lake doesn't have algal blooms and why it doesn't have aquatic weed problem, a vegetation problem, rooted aquatic problem. And this conclusion of mine is based on no information at all, other than we farm beside Otter Lake, and I'm somewhat familiar with it. But the shapes of the two basins are much different. Otter Lake is very open, wide open, good wind exposure. It's a big square lake, and it's shallow. It's only about 5 feet deep. And I think Jay was right when he said it's probably related to turbidity, but I think it's turbidity from the constant stirring up of the lake bottom by wave action. If the bottom's only 5 feet down, it's pretty easy for waves to reach down there and keep the sediments in a constant state of suspension. And regarding aquatic higher plant growth, rooted aquatic growth. That wave action also on wind-blown shores would provide a pretty hostile environment for aquatic plants to colonize. If Lizette's on the call, she would know a lot more about this possibility than I would. The 50s and 60s were when fish biology was king. A lot of people were fishing. Everybody wanted fishing improved. And a fish biologist had a new technique called stocking that they could use for lake improvement. And Lake Winnipeg had whitefish and pickerel hatcheries, several of them. The province had a trout hatchery in the Whiteshell. Rocky Mountain National Park had a hatchery at Deep Bay. And so a lot of lakes were being stocked. And I'm going to talk about a little lake that's 3 miles southwest of Erickson called Nora Lake. 66 acres, 25 feet deep. And it was stocked in the 50s with rainbow trout. And the fish just grew to beat hell, eating freshwater shrimp. And they had a nice deep orange color to them, much like a salmon. And they were stocked with fish out of the provincial hatchery. The following year, anglers started to catch them. Year after that, anglers were catching much bigger fish, 3 to 5 pounders. Year after that, 5 to 8 pounders. And then the year after that, there were no fish left. So the province restocked, and the same pattern, good years, and then the fish disappeared. So they did some testing on it and determined that the lake was winter killing, and it was a marginal winter kill lake. But during the years when it was productive, it was really productive. So when the Freshwater Institute came to Winnipeg and I became part of the Trout Farmer Project, it was thought that maybe we could use these lakes, like Nora Lake and like other ones along the south side, to produce an annual crop of fish. And winter kill was actually a good thing, not a bad thing. So the first year we stocked Nora Lake with rainbow trout from the provincial hatchery, and they were only about 1 inch long, and they went in June. And by fall, we fished them out, and they were only 7 inches long, not quite big enough for a commercial crop. But the potential was there because we had a really good recovery. So we looked at a whole bunch more lakes that winter between 68 and 69. And instead of waiting for these little fish from the provincial hatchery, we bought rainbow trout from a private hatchery in Washington State. And they came into Winnipeg at a size of about 3 inches long in May. And they were in plastic bags in cardboard boxes. And they had been in transit for 24 hours. We took them out to Nora Lake and 2 other lakes and put them in. And stocking 3-inch fish right after ice out was the secret. And these fish just grew like mad. And they were the basis for a developing trout farming industry at the time. Now, Nora Lake right now, because of what's happened with trout farming, is no longer stocked. It's a marginal winter kill lake, probably winter killing more frequently than it had in the past. It's a lake where a little bit of variation could turn it into a really good trout fishing lake. And you get those fish to overwinter, and you get that tremendous growth that I had described earlier. And I'll leave it to Mr. Sopuck to flesh out that concept a little bit more. After we had the initial success with Nora Lake, we were looking for more lakes in the area that we can stock. So my work in the winter of 68, 69 was to take air photos and go over them with a stereo viewer and come up with areas and depths. And you can get a rough idea of depth from a black and white air photo, because the deeper lakes show up a uniform light color, whereas lakes that are shallow and have a darker color and more variety of color. So anyway, we picked a whole bunch of lakes to stock the following year. And one of them was a little lake west of Elphinstone on the north side of 45, right where the power line crosses the highway, Lake 885. So we stocked Lake 885, and then we were visiting it every week after stocking in May to see how the lake was doing. We were doing temperature, oxygen profiles, and things were looking pretty good. The temperature was good, oxygen was really good, but we noticed this grass-clipping algae starting to appear in the water. And this was a phanozomenon that Jay had referred to in a previous talk. And the filaments got bigger and bigger as the weeks went by, and then they started to clump together. And then in early August, we went there, and boy, had things ever changed. The lake just smelled of sulfur. The water was cloudy. we went out there and the oxygen was zero top to bottom. I had never seen this before, and nobody on the crew had seen anything like this before. So I phoned the Freshwater Institute. Maybe all of their top people were out on projects, but I got a microbiologist, and he said, "Are you sure someone didn't throw a dead horse in the water?" Well, that was pretty unlikely, but that lake had the largest farmhouse that I had ever seen in the whole area. 3 chimneys, 2 staircases, even though it was empty at the time, and it had a manure pile right on the shoreline. So that became a lake of focus for the Freshwater Institute. There's a large number of scientific papers that have been written on that lake talking about the dynamics of nutrient cycling. We had a curtain on it, dividing it in half. We had docks on there with tubes. All various studies were done on the lake. That lake is quite famous in limnological circles. The farm has now been reoccupied. There's a new farm there and modern equipment, and it's a going concern. And I bet they don't have any idea of how famous that lake in their backyard is amongst limnologists from Europe.
Thank you very much, John. And what an informative presentation. Thank you. Our second presentation is entitled The Value and Significance of Manitoba's Parkland Fisheries by Bob Sopuck. Bob lives with his wife Caroline in the hills south of Rocky Mountain National Park, also known as the Horde Moraine. Bob is also a fisheries biologist who worked for the province in the earlier days, well, with John, and he's been involved with many conservation organizations and projects over the years as well. Bob has also recently served for 2 terms as Member of Parliament for Dauphin Swan River Neepawa constituency. And in that capacity, he sat on both the Environment and Fisheries parliamentary committees. Bob was the first chair of Flipper, the Fish and Lake Improvement Program for the Parkland region. And I should also mention that Bob has a great passion somehow for fishing. Bob, we're pleased to have you here tonight. Bob, go ahead.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I'm a passionate angler, as Jim said, and I take the view that angling is not a matter of life and death. It's actually more important than that. Having lived in the Parkland area for about 40 years, I have a little bit of knowledge or a little bit of experience with these lakes and worked with John way back in the 70s. He was actually my first boss, so any of my failings can be laid at his feet. In this area here, in terms of the fishery, the main species, of course, are the pike and the walleye, and in Clear Lake we have whitefish. I'm going to go over this fairly quickly because I'm extremely conscious of time. I'm going to pretend I'm back in Parliament with a very stern speaker with a stopwatch. Clear Lake, of course, has the whitefish. We have the aerated trout lakes as well, and John very eloquently described the productivity of these lakes and the ability to grow trout. These lakes are highly productive for fish. And to date, people, rightly so, are concerned about the excess productivity of these lakes causing winter kill and algal blooms. The flip side of that is fish grow extremely fast here. There's a terrific forage base for the fish, lots of insects. We have fathead minnows, tremendous forage fish, sticklebacks, and of course we have the famous freshwater shrimp, which actually are not shrimp, they're isopods. One only needs to catch a pike out of Sandy Lake, open it up, and it's absolutely full of freshwater shrimp. To give you an example of how productive our lakes are, when I was a summer student way back in the 70s, I was in the Lynn Lake area, caught a pike that was 42 inches long. That fish weighed 15 pounds. Many years later, when we were living out here, I caught a pike in Clear Lake. It just happened to, and that 15-pound fish, I mounted it and I have it here at home. I caught another 42-inch pike in Clear Lake, exactly the same length as the Lynn Lake pike, and that fish weighed 21 pounds. That gives an example of how productive our lakes are. Our lakes are quite variable when it comes to fishing quality and water quality, as we know. Some lakes produce fish that are very robust, very fat, high growth rate, some slightly less, but overall productivity and growth is extremely high here. And the big problem, if you're a retired parliamentarian like I am who loves to fish, your biggest decision on a spring day is which lake to fish on. A very happy problem to have. Angling is probably the largest outdoor activity in Canada. And I'm going to zoom up to the Canadian scale right now. And right now, the Canadian Sport Fishing Industry Association pointed out that in Canada, angling generates about $8.3 billion a year. More Canadian adults fish than play golf and hockey combined. Interestingly, anglers in Canada in that year caught 193 million fish, but retained only 63 million. Recreational anglers actually consumed less than 4% of the total fish harvested in Canada. And overall in Canada, the conference board did a study, 10.3 billion is spent by anglers in Canada. And if you add in hunting and shooting as well, the total of those outdoor activities generates $18.9 billion a year for the Canadian economy and 107,000 jobs and $6.1 billion in federal and provincial revenue. This study just came out not that long ago. It was early this year. You can find it on the website of Travel Manitoba. It's a 2019 economic and social impact of Manitoba's hunting and fishing industry. Just as an aside, I don't like the word industry. What I do is not an industry. It's part of my way of life. So in terms of, if you look on the right-hand side there, in Manitoba, 245,000 hunters and anglers spent nearly $480 million. And that does not include big ticket items like boats and ATVs. So that's just annual expenditures. And they interviewed the anglers and got their impression of Manitoba fishing. That brown trout you see that gentleman holding there, that is a Manitoba Parkland brown trout, probably taken out of Patterson Lake. This exemplifies how large these fish can grow. That fish is probably no more than 4 years old. A fish that size around Flin Flon, there's no brown trout there, but let's pretend, a fish that size in Flin Flon would easily be 2 or 3 times as old. So here's some of the industry-wide, the economic impact for Manitoba here. So you can see on the left-hand side, in terms of direct expenditures, angling, 268 million, hunting 212 million, which is really interesting because there's only a quarter of the number of hunting licenses as angling licenses, yet expenditures are about the same. So we're looking at employment in person years of angling and hunting, 5,500. Angling is about 3,000 jobs. And this next line is really interesting. Total provincial taxes collected, $96 million from angling and hunting. And even though I'm a friend of the current government, regardless of what political stripe you are, the amount of money that we spend on managing and enhancing our fish and wildlife resources pales in comparison to the amount of money and jobs and direct tax revenue that these two activities generate. And I'm happy to see that this government is now finally catching up and we're starting to fill positions that haven't been filled for 4 years. So here's a breakdown of angler and hunter spending. Manitobans far and away spend the most, but you know, you can see that non-residents spend a lot. Now, keep in mind, 2020 was an anomaly because of the coronavirus. This is pre-coronavirus, and the assumption is that the world will return to normal, you know, once we're all vaccinated and so on. But so this is a pretty good snapshot of what our angling and hunting activities generate. So by and large, people were pretty satisfied with the quality of hunting and angling, but anglers and hunters are very, very passionate conservationists and tend to be a little bit more pessimistic about the state of wildlife than they need to be. So in the questionnaires that Travel Manitoba asked of these anglers and hunters, the theme of more conservation, more fish management, more wildlife management came up over and over again. So you can see where my cursor is, if you can see that. One Manitoba angler said, "You'd love to see more stocking programs, better aeration on the lakes again, winter kill." Of course, the issue of infrastructure. And for those of you who have lakes in your areas or near your towns, and you want to attract more fishermen, anglers, this is what they want: fish cleaning areas, plowing access to lakes, more conservation officers enforcing the laws, and so on. What's really interesting, and this is apropos or regarding this time of year, ice fishing has exploded. one only needs to go to Lake Winnipeg. On Lake Manitoba, Lake Winnipeg, I'm going to talk about this later on. You can go on a nice weekend day, and there will be up to 3,000 trucks on Lake Winnipeg fishing. The traffic jam up Highway 7 and Highway 8, I guess on those good days, is phenomenal. Now, this is partly due to the coronavirus. People are going outside more, but ice fishing is really expanded. You can see it around here on Clear Lake and Sandy Lake and so on. So anyway, that talks about growth opportunities and challenges. In terms of, to give you an example, we talked about the jobs. There's about 3,000 jobs related to sport fishing. Logging, for example, has the same number of jobs, 3,000 jobs, but generates less money than angling does, and so on and so on. So we can see that from an economic perspective, angling is very, very significant. And I was pleased to see that in the last throne speech, there was recognition of the importance of anglers and angling and hunting. Work will continue with all of our partners to conserve and sustain regional fish and wildlife populations for future generations. And we are getting more fisheries biologists being hired. So let's look at some case histories here. And the reason I'm just looking more at a provincial-wide perspective is that the data in this area is quite poor. But I think we can extrapolate as to the importance of angling here. For example, on Lake Winnipeg, there's a move to go from a commercial fishery to a recreational fishery. The commercial fishermen are being bought out, and the anglers, and it's now becoming an angling lake. For example, again, I talked about the 3,000 trucks on a given day on Lake Winnipeg. In January 25th, 26th, and February 1st of this year, the Manitoba Wildlife Federation did a vehicle count, and in 3 days there were 2,364 vehicles drive on the lake, 3 people per vehicle. That's 7,092 people fishing over the course of 3 days. And based on the calculations that I've done on the value of an angler day, that generated about $135,000 for the Manitoba economy. I see that Trevor McGuire was on the call, and I'm going to talk a little bit about his favorite lake, Pelican Lake. That lake used to winter kill it winter killed in 85, 89, 91 to 94, and 2004, based on the data that I've got. In 2015, major aeration was put into Pelican Lake. That lake still blooms, unfortunately, but from what I gathered, does not winter kill. So if you look at economic activity, in March of 2019, there was an ice fishing derby that attracted 540 anglers. An angler day, trust me on this, is worth about $57 to the Manitoba economy. So that particular day was a boost of $31,000 for the local economy around Pelican Lake. I also see that Mervyn Starzyk is on the call, and they had a big problem a couple of years ago with Shoal Lake winter kill. I read the articles, Mervyn, it was devastating for the community. Even though the water quality of Shoal Lake can be problematic, it was a highly successful fishery. And from what I gather, the fish kill affected the entire community. This is how important fish are to local communities. The other, and this now I'm coming to the Parklands here. The arm of Rossburn did a major study looking at the value of parkland aeration, and the study was it was a comprehensive one. It was entitled "Economic Evaluation of Lake Aeration: Rossburn Town and Rural Municipality" by A&E Consultants. They did a survey of anglers that fished in the area. They're both U.S. anglers that primarily targeted the aerated trout lakes, and also Canadian visitors who fished all the other lakes. American fly fishermen will not come up here to fish for walleye and pike. They won't. They will come up here to fish for trophy trout in our aerated trout lake. Just a little anecdote. I live 4 miles north of Course de Pine Lake. A few years ago when the lake was really hot, it's coming back now. It should be good this year. There was about 15 vehicles there in the fall. A lot of them from Alberta, some from Montana, some from BC. I talked to a gentleman who was coming off the lake, because I like to talk to folks, and he told me what a great fishery it was, how excited he was to be here. And I asked him, so where are you from? He said, Spokane, Washington. So this guy came all the way from Spokane, Washington to fish one of our aerated trout lakes That's basically a man-made fishery based on aeration. And again, John spoke about that. In terms of Dauphin Lake, for example, there's anywhere between 200 and 300 ice huts on Dauphin Lake every year, and many people, maybe some people on this call, often fish Dauphin Lake. Highly productive fishery, not a trophy fishery, so it doesn't attract non-resident anglers, but is worth millions to the town of Dauphin. And many years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I think, John, you may remember this, the Dauphin Lake fishery was a basket case, and it has come back extremely strong due to conservation, and it is now a highly, highly productive fishery. So what are the major threats to our angling, our sport fishery? Well, poor water quality is definitely one of them. You know, Shoal Lakes suffered that winter kill. Poor water quality can induce winter kill, although many lakes, you know, even in spite of poor water quality, because of the water volume and depth, do not winter kill. I think the last time Sandy Lake winter killed was 1986, same year that Sopuck Lake winter killed. So many of our deeper, high water volume lakes can survive poor water quality, although the aesthetic problems that causes for communities and beaches is something we need to deal with. Invasive species can be a problem. So in our trout lakes, for example, it's the kiss of death when pike get into one of those lakes. I'm slowly beginning to realize and conclude that perch aren't as big of a threat as pike, because the trout will eat the perch, but the pike will basically eliminate the trout. So overall, I'd like to see a ramping up of the angling work in this area here. But I want to stress to all the participants that all of our fisheries here are basically in really good shape. There are some localized issues with overfishing. I know some of the anglers are complaining about small fish and Sandy Lake and so on. But even if a lake in this area happens to be overfished, I'm talking lakes with native fish populations, they will bounce back extremely quickly, especially walleye, because walleye are very efficient feeders. They'll bounce back very quickly if given a chance. We need to really enhance our aeration program as well, because again, the benefits for our communities are quite significant. One thing I want to, just a quick sociological comment about anglers and hunters. Basically, we can call us consumptive users versus non-consumptive users of the resources. One of the characteristics of anglers and hunters is that we cherish abundance. So when we see 500 mallards flying, we'd rather see 5,000 mallards. If I catch, 5 fish a day, I like to catch 10. So when anglers and hunters talk about conservation, it's always about numbers, populations, how are things doing? Did they overwinter well? Did the lake winter kill? So on and so on. And we're very prone as a community to want to get in there and conserve and manage our fish and wildlife resources. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. We'll turn it over to Dennis to do the Q&A.
Thanks, Jim. Good job, guys. That was pretty awesome. John, how about you started off the trout farming project? What happened there and why?
I guess it's like a lot of brand new enterprises. It looked so good at the start. I mean, we stocked a lake off PR 270 west of Erickson called Lake 154 in 1969 with 5,000 3-inch rainbow trout from Washington State. And we fished it out in the fall and we recovered 70% of what we had put in at a weight of between 12 and 14 ounces. Beautiful salmon colored and beautiful flavor. And that lake made all of the newspapers, Free Press Weekly, Manitoba Cooperative, the whole works. A new pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for farmers. Everybody thought this was just going to be great. But over the years, things didn't work out quite so well. For one thing, the birds discovered that these newly stocked rainbow trout were sitting ducks. So you'd get the terns picking them off when the tern migration came through. And then the kiss of death was when the cormorants discovered them, because the cormorants were there all summer. And then some muddy flavor started to develop in some lakes. And once you get people concerned about the flavor of a product you're trying to sell, you're not in good shape. And we could not duplicate those early percent recoveries for some reason. And I don't know why this is, but this often happens in science. Things look so good initially, and then you add a few more years to the data set and things start to ramp down. Good support from the farmers. The Manitoba Rainbow Trout Farmers Association was formed. Rudy Usick was carrying this one on his back. They were importing fish. Farmers were buying fish from a facility at Rivers or the Rolling River Reserve. Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation was buying the product in the fall. But again, they lost interest because of flavor problems. So I guess, Dennis, it eventually just petered away, and there's still a few people doing it, but it's nowhere near the success that everyone was hoping for when we started it.
Bob, this is probably one for you. In terms of the value of parkland aeration, and you spoke about making a trout fishery based on aeration. Could you talk about how to do that and kind of what a relative range of costs that might be, depending on, of course, the size of the lake and all?
We have a number of aerated lakes. So if you think about a crescent going from Minnedosa to Roblin, we have Anton's Lake by Minnedosa. We've got Pybus Lake by Sandy Lake, Corstorphine Lake, Patterson Lake, and then Spear Lake is going to be coming back on. And the two Goose Lakes out of Roblin, and then Twin Lake, Tees, and Percy. So we have a plethora of lakes, and the issue is management. The problem is we get the productivity is there. That's a natural. We don't have to worry about fish growth or any of that. What we have to worry about is primarily invasive species, the perch and pike. My take, and I don't know if you agree with me, John, but there doesn't seem to be any diminution of the food supplies when these fish are put in. Keep in mind, these lakes have been fishless for 10,000 years, and all of a sudden we throw a top predator in, and you would think there would be a significant effect. And they really, based on our experiences, the growth rate really hasn't changed. What I would like to see happen is to adopt a sort of an agricultural metaphor where if a lake does get a trout lake gets invaded with invasive species, every 8 or 9 years, you turn the aeration off, kill the lake out, rather like round up a field of quackgrass, kill the lake out and start all over again. The beauty of our area is that we have enough lakes we can do that. And one comment about our area, there is no other place in North America like the Manitoba and Saskatchewan prairie parklands for the ability to produce large trophy trout. And that's because it's not, the lakes are super productive, but it doesn't get really, really hot. You get equally productive lakes down in Utah and Nebraska and so on, but their summer temperatures are way too high, given that we're stocking cold water fish. And even in some hot summers here, you do get some summer kill because a rainbow trout, when it's up around 28, 29 degrees, it's highly stressed, which is why American anglers, even though they can catch them, these fly fishermen will not come up in the middle of summer because the hooking mortality of these fish is too high. These people are so careful about the resource. I'm convinced that if a fish died, they would have a funeral for it. That's how sustainable these fisheries are. But intensive management is what we need to keep them going. Having said that, I think we're looking at some tremendous trout fishing over the next couple of years.
And why is it? What are some of the factors that contribute to such rapid growth at such a young age here in this part of Manitoba?
I'll split this answer with John, but I did my master's on rainbow trout, and because trout feed lower on the food chain, I mean, sure, they'll eat minnows and they'll eat all that, but they have an ability to eat invertebrates and insect, all invertebrates, the freshwater shrimp. So we have a fantastic array of productivity in these lakes, and combined with their efficiency to convert that productivity to fish flesh, that's why these lakes can do so well. John, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think you're right. The temperature is pretty ideal. I mean, if you go back to ice off, the lakes warm up quite quickly, and then they don't really hit lethal temperatures in the summertime. For most of the year, most of the summer anyway, it's in a pretty decent temperature range for rainbow trout. But I think the key is the food. I think it is Gammarus lacustris, the freshwater shrimp, because we have had trout farming lakes where the lake had sticklebacks and fathead minnows in it, and the trout were eating sticklebacks and fathead minnows because they had kept the gammarus population down quite low. And those fish were white-fleshed. They didn't taste quite as good. They weren't as appealing to look at, and they didn't grow as fast. So I think a lot of it is the food source, that one species. Well, there's two species. They're closely related, though.
Yeah, just one more comment, Dennis. I invite anybody here who hasn't done so to get a pitchfork, for example, go to the edge of one of our trout lakes and just scoop up some of the vegetation, throw it in, in a big jar, and it'll be a mass of living creatures that are the basis of the food chain. This is one of the reasons that the prairie pothole lakes are so productive for waterfowl, because these invertebrates are key food for juvenile waterfowl.
This is a compliment coming here from the vice president of the Kilpatrick Fly Fishers in Saskatoon. Compliment to you guys, the efforts you've put in over the years, and some of our members love your Manitoba lakes. And also a question from the same source: some U.S. states stock both pike and trout in the same lake, and Colorado is an example of that. And why do you think it works for them, or does it?
Boy, that baffles me, because perhaps the lakes are really large. The only thing I can think of, there's habitat stratification. So pike are primarily littoral, shallow water, shore-bound fish. I'm generalizing a bit here, but there'd be habitat segregation, and the trout are what we call pelagic open water fish, and that's probably the way. Our lakes are far too small to do that, and there would be a significant intermixing between both the pike and the trout.
Yeah, I think it would also depend upon the size as well. I mean, are they stocking fingerlings of both species at the same time? If that's the case, then perhaps the rainbow trout could go fast enough that they would always be too big for the pike to eat.
Yeah, but eventually the pike would get large enough that they would start to take off that year's stocking. They would start to pick up the fingerlings. So.
I think you partially answered this question perhaps already in your comments about food and water temperature, but are there any other factors that contribute to making prairie lakes in this part of Manitoba so valuable, Bob?
Well, again, it's the productivity, and John spoke at length about the quality of the soils, and everything comes from the soil. And when we look at the fish and wildlife abundance here, so, for example, on my little 480 acres of land, I probably got 20 deer. I can have 3 moose on the place and 6 elk and 8 bears. I mean, you go up around the Flin Flon area on 480 acres, you will be lucky to get 1 moose track across that in a whole year. So again, where we are here, I think it all stems from soil productivity, creating just, incredible plant growth, terrestrial plants, aquatic plants, which in turn support the invertebrates that everything feeds on. One thing about the forage base, which I found very interesting, I love to ice fish, and I have an underwater camera. Anybody on this call who ice fishes, I would urge you to get an underwater camera, because you learn as much about lakes just by watching as you do by catching. What I saw in Clear Lake was remarkable, the forage base there. I saw things like spot-tailed shiners, common shiners, log perch, baby whitefish, species that you do not see outside of Clear Lake, because I always wondered why Clear Lake was so damn productive, given how clear it is. But again, I think it all relates to the soils. John, you want to add on to that?
Only one thing I would add is that we used to do conductivity measurements whenever we visited a lake, because conductivity is an easy measurement to do using a meter, and it's an indication of salinity. And generally speaking, the lakes were all good, although there were the odd lake out there that was too saline and did not perform properly because it was too saline. You wouldn't know that to look at the lake. You'd know it right away if you drank the water, because it would taste like it had a pretty good concentration of Epsom salts in it. But there are certainly salty lakes all across the West.
So what are some of the indicators that might suggest we have issues in our fish population?
Well, if you look at a natural fish population, Dennis, and try to decide whether it's being overfished or not, the age structure will shift and that there will be no big fish left. That's one indication. And biologists also do something called catch per effort, where you set a gill net and leave it overnight and count the number of fish that you catch. And you can use that as a census tool year after year. So if you're monitoring a lake over a large number of years and you see a declining catch per effort, you will hit a point where you're in trouble.
Yeah. What's also interesting, and it seems counterintuitive, is that when a fish population is overfished, the remaining fish grow faster, as if to compensate. And as well, the age at first reproduction goes down. So for example, let's say walleye start to reproduce in Clear Lake at age 6. If it was really heavily fished, you would start to see mature fish who are 5 years old, 4 years old, and so on. And as John said, heavy fishing tends to cream off the larger and most productive fish. But I go back to my point about anglers in Canada harvesting about 4% of the overall fish catch in the entire country. What I'm very proud of the angling community about is this catch and release ethic has taken hold significantly. And so you don't see a lot of big fish being killed anymore like you used to. We're in this area here, and again, I'm strongly supportive of regulations that prevent the killing of large mature fish. And I go back to the point that right now, almost all of our fisheries are in pretty good shape. If you look at the size, like you can catch fairly large walleye and pike in just about any lake. And also what I look at is the robustness of the fish. The term that they use is the condition. It's the ratio of the length to the girth. These fish are extremely fat, which is an indicator of highly productive water body.
Yeah, Bob and I did a creel survey of Clear Lake in 86 and 87. And the question the park was asking at the time was, is the angler harvest exceeding the productive capacity of the lake? So they wanted to know how many fish anglers were removing. So we did the survey and we did the calculation, and we concluded that angler harvest was not coming anywhere near the productive capacity of the lake. There used to be a figure in common use back then of 3 pounds per acre per year. If you had lots of shoreline, you might go up to 3.5 pounds. And I think we use 3 pounds. Clear Lake is 7,000 acres or something like that. And the angler harvest was nowhere near what would commonly be called the productive capacity of the lake.
And Bob, this is in response to your comment about growing pike and trout in the same lake. Perhaps they do better in deeper water. And the comment in reply to that was that in fact, in Colorado, they're doing this in reservoirs. So they're likely are to be deep, which would support your thinking.
Yeah, see, Lake Diefenbaker, for example, they stock trout as well, and they grow to an enormous size. And our friend from Saskatoon, maybe he'll confirm that. That's my last report. But there's also pike and walleye in Lake Diefenbaker, but it's probably big enough that it doesn't matter.
And another question: how effective is aeration on these kinds of? How effective is aeration on these kinds of lakes?
Well, it depends what the goal is. If the goal is to create a brand new fishery where there was none before, keep in mind, these aerated trout lakes, they were not fisheries. They were basically nice looking, but empty lakes. Basically, you aerate them, it's kind of add water and stir. You create these lakes, I'm going to be flippant here, you create them out of nothing. And it's all, again, I got to be a little careful, but it's almost foolproof. If a lake has public access, if it has hydro beside it, if it has areas that are 15 to 18 feet deep, you can almost guarantee it's going to work. Almost. Now, when it comes to aerating lakes that have native fish populations in them, that's a different story, because Rossman Lake, Arrow Lake, Silver Beach Lake, Shoal Lake, those are all aerated to keep existing fish populations going. Pelican Lake's exactly the same. They're two different things. Fish in those lakes are self-sustaining. You don't have to stock them. Whereas the aerated trout lakes, they absolutely have to be stocked every year because the fish cannot spawn in those lakes. And someone mentioned just a while ago about the cost. An aerator, to put an aerator is about $30,000 to $40,000. That's a one-time cost. The hydro for a largest lake like Patterson Lake or Spear Lake, it's about $3,000 a year. And the provincial government has been very generous over the years with stocking the lakes. The weak link in this whole chain is that we're asking municipalities to pick up the aeration costs, and some have done it with great glee. Others are with strong approval. Others simply refuse to do it in spite of the fact there may be excellent lakes in their municipalities, simply because they don't see aerating lakes as part of their mandate.
Is this a way that lake communities could use kind of the economic analysis of the benefit of the lake and the fishery to their advantage?
Sure. I mean, that's why I used all the numbers. It drives me crazy from the standpoint of how valuable these fisheries are, how many people use them. Angling is growing by leaps and bounds, and Manitoba is one of the few places where that's happening. New Canadians are taking up angling in droves, and all you have to do when it reconvenes, just go to the Winnipeg Boat Show, and you'll see $25,000 boats, fishing boats being sold. So the problem is the angling community is not well organized. Angling is a dispersed activity, and even though there's lots of dollars spread around the province, it's often not seen, if you know what I mean. And so decision makers often tend to shrug and say, well, why did we spend money on that? It's getting better. The current minister, Blaine Peterson, he's been on Lake Winnipeg. He's an avid angler and hunter himself. It's just amazing to see the activity there. And again, what the province has done on Lake Winnipeg to bolster the fishery there, they are buying out the commercial fishing licenses. They have spent $5 million to buy out the licenses and reduce the quota on a regular basis, creating a fishery that's worth millions. And I hate to go on and on, but there are cottage owners in Beconia and around Lake Winnipeg who are advertising their cottages for rent to ice fishermen for the winter. And the response from ice fishermen has been phenomenal. So there's another, I know somebody who's making $5,000 a month renting their cottage to ice fishermen. And one last point, I sorry for going on and on. Big sporting goods stores in Minnesota, North Dakota, actually have seminars on how to ice fish Lake Winnipeg. You can go on YouTube and see it. That's how popular and valuable these fisheries are.
That's pretty awesome. John, I'm curious, when did phosphorus content in lake water first become recognized as the foundation for growing fauna? Was there a point at which it was recognized and which there was noticeable change in lake water quality?
Well, I guess it would stand to reason because nutrients for algae would be about the same as nutrients for field crops, and farmers have always known that you have to add nitrogen and phosphorus. But the definitive experiment was done in the experimental lakes area in northwestern Ontario around 1970, when they took one of their lakes and put a impermeable curtain across it, and they treated one side with phosphorus and the other side without. And then they took a picture of the difference after the algae had developed, and it was night and day. I mean, you talk about communicating science results through a picture, that was classic. And that was really, I think, where it came from. They had concluded, and these guys were high-powered scientists, they had concluded that phosphorus was the key ingredient affecting lake productivity.
Dennis?
Yes.
To show what a nerd I am about all of this stuff, I've had on my wall in my office here a picture of that lake that I look at every single day. That was Lake 227. Can you see the lake being split in two? The upper half has got the phosphorus in it, and you can see where the curtain was, and then you can see where the nitrogen was added. The difference is absolutely remarkable. This is probably the most famous photograph in limnological science history. So John is absolutely correct.
So was there a time, guys, when lake water quality was deteriorating before we started to use agriculture extensively, or use fertilizer in agriculture extensively?
Well, there were always marginal winter kill lakes even before agricultural development, because as I had mentioned before, the lakes were on a very slow progression to greater eutrophication. And lakes that had too much productivity under natural, what we would call natural conditions, would still be of a marginal winter kill lake nature, in that they would winter kill every 5 years or something like that. But it didn't really accelerate until agricultural development came along.
And so what happens in the lake sediment to phosphorus when you get excess turbidity in the sediment area or at the bottom of the lake?
Well, I'm not a chemist. Jay is the chemist, but I know that a certain amount of phosphorus is locked up in deep sediments every year. So it's not like all of it has to run out the outflow. A certain amount is lost to deep sediments and essentially becomes unavailable. But I would defer to Jay on this one.
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I can comment on that. I think that the term lost to deep sediments, it can be lost in different ways, and it depends what it's binding to. So it can be binding to a wide variety of minerals at the bottom of the lake, and some of them hold on to phosphorus more tightly than others. And that bond between the phosphorus and the various minerals can depend on different things. So the classic examples we keep hearing about is when it's bound to iron, which is one of the minerals that can really bind to phosphorus. It only binds to the reduced form or to the oxidized form, sorry, rust, basically. When you drop the oxygen out of the system, what happens is the reduced iron doesn't hang on to the phosphorus, and they both come out into the water, and so you're releasing phosphorus that way. Other calcium-based minerals, they lose the phosphorus when you drop the pH on them, and that can either be through, we see it in Ontario a fair bit when you have acid rain and you're acidifying lakes, but you also see it in swings with productivity. So you have all kinds of funny things happening when you add productivity to a lake through vegetation and algae. What tends to happen is the algae or the primary productivity, it strips the carbon dioxide out of the lake, increasing the pH of the lake, making it more alkaline. What happens when the reverse starts happening and you start having the respiration and degradation? You can have pretty wide pH swings. And so we can see in some lakes pulses of phosphorus coming off the bottom with pH swings. So there's all kinds of complex interactions that can happen there. But so again, I think an important point is when we talk about phosphorus being lost to deep sediments, this is how it happens, and this is how it can be released again. And what we often see, particularly with the oxygen situation, is the phosphorus is lost to deep sediments in the lake over time. And maybe let's take our lakes, maybe in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, the phosphorus was being bound up in our prairie lakes. And then we hit a threshold where there was so much phosphorus, so much productivity in the lake that now we're decomposing so much algae and plant matter that our oxygen drops. Well, guess what? All that phosphorus that was bound up is now being released because we changed the oxygen. So it was just sleeping on us and waiting to I think I referred to it as it bites us in the end, in that it comes back to bite us. If we let things go too long, nature tends to happen in thresholds, not a straight line, but a threshold where we get to a point where everything changes on us. And that's where we see all the phosphorus coming back out. And I think that's where we are in a number of our lakes with their poor water quality now.
Yeah,
Thanks,
this was
Jay.
quite controversial at the time, Dennis, when they came out with that conclusion in 1970 about phosphorus. I know there was a group in the US, a group of university people who said, no, it can't be phosphorus, it's carbon. How can that developing algal bloom get enough carbon in order to reach those levels of productivity? And there were experiments done at experimental lakes area to show that it was quite easy to provide that amount of carbon. Second one was nitrogen, and City of Winnipeg was asking this question. To protect Lake Winnipeg, do we need nitrogen removal and phosphorus removal? And there was quite a bit of controversy at the time. And I think now phosphorus has carried the day, and I don't think City of Winnipeg is considering putting nitrogen removal in. But I'm not current on this one.
That's great, guys. I want to thank you so much, both for your presentations and for your questions, and for you, Jay, coming out of the bleachers. Thank you so much.
The bullpen.
There we go. Well, welcome to join in. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
As well. Thank you, Jay, for joining us there and contributing. And thanks, Bob and John, for your excellent presentations and a great Q&A session there. And thanks, Dennis, for helping with the Q&A. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.